Jesus talked about tearing down the temple. And of course, John adds the commentary there. He's talking about his own body because he knows he's going to die. Now, that would be appropriate because actually, though John puts this episode in chapter 2 of his gospel, we know it happened in the last week of his life. And he knows that once he does this thing where he goes and drives out the money changers in all the ways that they're using the temple as a money-making machine for the elite, he knows he's going to be in trouble. He knows they're going to be after him. He doesn't have long to live. So he knows talking about tearing down the house is actually a current event for him. But there is both historical fact and metaphor that is useful when we're talking about tearing down the temple. In fact, the temple in Jerusalem has been torn down twice. The first temple that was built there was called the Temple of Solomon, built around 950 years before Jesus. That temple lasted until the 6th century, the 500s before Jesus was born. That temple was great and glorious. It was the assurance for the people of Israel that God was with them and that God would bless them. And the prophets began to see that they were worshiping the temple itself rather than God. And so we know that under Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, the temple was torn down and the whole nation of Judah was destroyed. They were eventually allowed to come back. But during that time, when the temple had been destroyed, the people had to take a new look at their faith, to take a new look at their God. And even the Jewish historians recognize that the character of Judaism changed during that time. When the temple was torn down, Judaism took on monotheism in a more universal way. Before that, so much of what they did and what they understood was the God of the whole universe picks us. We are the chosen people. And they began to understand a God of the universe, of all nations. They began to understand that they were chosen to be the witness, the testimony of a God of love. They began to understand that much better through the prophets that were preaching at the time. So it was years later when the temple was rebuilt. And then King Herod, just before Jesus is born, starts to rebuild it and make it fresh and expand it, make it newer, bigger, more elaborate, and actually increase the places that could bring in the money. So the temple was rebuilt, but the people had forgotten the lesson, and they began to argue about control of the temple, control of their faith, control of their people. And so eventually, we know in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And within 50 years, the nation of Judea had been dispersed and would stay that way for 1,500 years or more. So the temple being destroyed is historical fact. The metaphors that can come from that are very helpful for us. When should a temple be torn down? When do you need to just raise the whole thing and start over again? In the history of this church, there's another historical fact that's an appropriate metaphor. Historians of church cycles tell us that a church needs to reinvent itself, or within 80 years, it will start to go out of existence. Most churches in the United States, Protestant churches, don't outlive the children of the founders of the church because they refuse to change. If a church recognizes that and is willing to change its character, its outreach, its pathos, its passions, then they can renew themselves. So the church pioneer, first Christian at that time, 1849, by 1920, it was getting old as a church. But they had renewed themselves, and they decided to move out here. They called themselves First Congregational Church at that time. And once this building was built, they went back to tear down the old building and realized it was about to collapse. That's historical fact, but it's also appropriate metaphor. If they hadn't had the vision and the foresight to take on a new site, a new building, and a new mission, they would have collapsed. Not just as a church structure, but as a congregation. And so the church needs to be renewed. And people who have been around Pioneer now for the last 30 years recognize that we have changed our mission, changed our passions, changed our focus on where our ministry is and how it should be conducted. And so we're on the third lifetime, if you would, as a church. And so that is appropriate metaphor for a congregation. And I want to share with you what happened with me. And I would call it a dream, but it felt more like a vision. When I was going through the time when I knew I could not stay where I was, and I left where I was, but I did not yet know where I would be. I had not found the United Church of Christ yet. I had this vision that 3 men came to me, and I knew that we had a good relationship. And I proudly showed these people, these visitors, my church. Let me show you this church I've built. And actually, I had been part of a brand new building of a church in Midland, Texas. But as I showed them the church, the pews just disappeared into the ground. The beautiful front of the church just hazed over and you couldn't see anything. And the walls started to disappear and crumble away. And I was in shock. What is happening to this church? And then the visitors kindly told me, that's okay. We'll help you rebuild it. It's okay. We'll help you rebuild it. And that message, I knew, meant that God was going to help me change my whole theology. Help me change my whole understanding of church, what it should be and how it can be built together and how it can maintain the beauty of its structure. How do you keep a church vital? How do you keep a church beautiful? Not just the building, but the people, the mission, the passions of the church. How do you stay spiritually refreshed? Last week, I told you a story about knives. I'll tell it to you again so you don't have to struggle to remember it. But there was a person who was known as a great spiritual leader, and the question was asked, how do you know if somebody is truly following God, is really in their heart following God? And the answer is, that's the person who has dropped the knife. That's the person who has dropped the knife that is too often used to hurt himself. That story has stuck with me because there is a song that is currently pretty popular. I think it was even sung at the Grammys, that uses that idea of a knife in a different way. The song is "Take Me to Church." And the chorus goes like this. Take me to church. I'll worship at the shrine of your lies. I'll worship like a dog at the shrine of your lies. I'll tell you my sin so you can sharpen your knives. I'll tell you my sin so you can sharpen your knives. That's the experience of Hosier, the one who composed and sang that song. Is that the experience of most people for church? That they think coming to church is where they're supposed to reveal their guilt so that they can be made to feel more guilty? Where they can come and be put down even more, no matter who they are? Is that the experience of churches, that they feel like knives are being stuck in them, like their heart is being cut? If that's what people are experiencing, we need to tear that church down. We need to change. We need to be the ones who drop the knives. We need to be the ones who stop hurting ourselves by constantly saying how bad we are. We need to stop beating up ourselves spiritually. We talk so much about sin, it seems like we don't talk enough about the goodness that we are capable of doing. Can we make a difference? Can we lift other people up? Can we know that we are accepted and welcomed by God's grace? Can you drop the knife and stop using it on yourself first? Because then, maybe people like Hosier won't compose those words and feel like the only reason they're supposed to come to church is so that they can be judged, so their hearts can be cut up and pierced. Maybe people can come to church and find warmth and experience love and leave with joy. Maybe we can refresh our relationships with one another. Yes, that may mean that we have to confess how we have wronged one another in the past. But it should start with the fact that we are in a relationship. We are in a covenant relationship. That's what our church is about. It's not about join this church, follow our rules. It's join this church, be in a relationship with us. That's why when we talk about membership, we talk about a covenant relationship. And that's what the membership is. And that relationship establishes that there is a love that God has for all people. And we are part of that love, and we are reflectors of that love. We are expressions of that love. We are the ones who will make that love take on flesh and bone. We are the ones who will keep the passion of the church new, welcoming, divine. Amen.